Okay, so this is my first try on of the makeup with my headpiece for Maghda. I'm very nervous because I'm really afraid this is gonna look really stupid. Holy shit.
So the very first thing that you're going to want to do if you want to make any headdress as stupid as this piece of shit, you're going to want to wrap yourself in saran wrap. You're really going to want to like cover your head, humble yourself, wrap yourself in masking tape, make yourself look like the egg that you know you are deep, deep, deep down inside your soul. Egg. Glorious egg. Once you've submitted yourself over to the egg gods, you're going to want to take your egg off of your head and you're actually going to want to smash it into smithereens. Your real goal here is to try to make this egg lay flat. You're going to have to cut lots and lots of slits into it, force it into submission, but once you've got it, you'll be excellent and on your way. This smashed up flattened egg is going to be the pattern for your base of your headdress. Go ahead, cut it out of whatever fabric you desire. I chose a 4-way stretch suede to help tie in some other elements of my costume and because I really like the texture. Make sure that you give yourself seam allowance along all edges, including the opening if you're going to be doing any sort of facing or binding. And always make sure to mark your darts. Like seriously, don't forget that. Don't make a Haley mistake and forget to mark your darts. Once you've marked them, go ahead, pin them together. I try to pin all my darts together at once before I take it over my sewing machine. I feel like it's more efficient that way, but I guess you do you. And of course, a very, very necessary wine break right here. Very important to the whole process, keep that in mind. So unfortunately at this part in this build, I actually went ahead and I had sewn my darts, but I didn't record that. So I'm now adding on some binding for the front of this headpiece. I just made some bias binding out of the same gold fabric that I've used in other parts of the costume. We're suddenly talking with an accent, I guess that's just how it goes. But take your time, make sure you line everything up. You want this to look really, really nice. Details around the face, you always really want to take your time on because when you get photos done of you at a convention, it's always going to include your face and you don't want to have details that you just overlooked or were a little sloppy on. Like you can skimp on the shoes, that don't matter as long as your face looks good, you know what I mean? Anyway, take your time, bind this well, make it look lovely and perfect and neat and everything else your heart desires, okay? At this point, I also went ahead and I pinned under all of my edges so I could do like a test fit of this costume so I could see just how much of an egghead I really looked like with this headdress on and whether or not I needed to abort mission like super early on. Also, I have absolutely no idea why I decided to do it in this order, but I went ahead and I installed the neck piece before I actually attached down the binding. This was pretty simple, and I just made sure to edge stitch everything down so it kept the shape that I wanted. Now presenting the egghead. This looks atrocious. This whole little snap that I got off of my Instagram story was me talking about how I looked like an egg, because I did. All hail the egg overlords. After submitting myself as a sacrifice to the egg overlords, it was time to start working on the horns for my headdress. I first modeled and sculpted them out in Fusion 360 and Blender, and then I brought them over to Pepakura to try and make a pattern design. This program is incredibly intuitive, very easy to use, 10 out of 10, do recommend, except maybe not really because I was definitely working on this for way too long. I think it took me about an hour and a half to just get one part of this horn done. And this isn't even a very complicated design. This was very straightforward. I'm not sure I'm going to use Pepakura very much with other builds. It's definitely a cool tool to keep in my arsenal, but man, what a time sink. Goodness. With my paper model in hand, I was then able to separate it into like chunks to make an actual pattern for foam. I ended up with, I believe, 8 pattern pieces, and to help me keep track of all of these different patterns, because they're kind of similar shapes but they're very specific in where they go, I made sure that I labeled them with both registration marks on the edges, and I numbered them 1 through 8 so that way I know exactly what order each one needs to go to. This was definitely a lifesaver because once I cut out all 16 for both horns, it was atrocious. I cut my horn pieces out of 4mm foam with the scissors because it just felt like a lot of effort to pull out the X-Acto knife for this. I don't know why. It's very basic shapes. Nothing really needed to be beveled. They just needed to be nice, straight-ish, curved edges, and scissors could accomplish that easily. And I felt like it. Like, what? Duh, that's it. I need no other reason. I don't need to justify my choices to you. Hello? Once all my pieces were cut out, I went ahead and I glued them together with contact cement. A lot of people use barge. I don't have easy access to barge. I guess I could just go to Candy Leather now that I think about it, because I live close to one. Anyway, I use like Weldwood DAP contact cement, and it works great for me. Go ahead, put that stuff on. You want to let it dry until it's not tacky anymore, and then you want to carefully put your pieces together. Carefully. I mean, this stuff is intense. Once you put it on and a bond has occurred, the only way that you're really going to separate those pieces is by either cutting them or ripping them apart. The foam will rip before the glue gives way, which is both a blessing for when you want something sturdy, but a curse for when you inevitably get really tired and mess up really bad. Not that I know from experience. Can you find the exact moment of disappointment when I try these horns on and I'm just so upset with the shape and the size and how they look on my noggin? Because I can. I truly can. I'm amazed they turned out well. That's all I'm gonna say. And now for what I would consider to be the most iconic part of my horns for Maghda, the velvet scales. So I used one layer of velvet and then another layer of black satin, which acted as kind of a lining for these individual petals. In total, there were over 126 petals between the two horns for a total of like, what, 252 pieces of actual individual petals being cut out from both the satin and the velvet. This was incredibly tedious. And there were multiple times throughout this process specifically where I was like, this is worthless. I'm not gonna like these horns. It's not gonna be worth my time. I will have wasted 2 weeks, because this took me 2 weeks. I would get off of work, I would sit down upstairs at my sewing machine, and I would just work at this until like 2 in the morning. To me, this project was the absolute definition of trust the process. Every single part of this stupid headdress looked bad until it was all together. And it really wasn't until that final moment when I put everything on that it came together to me. For a little extra oomph and to help bring definition between these petals, I took my airbrush and I actually airbrushed a black gradient from the bottom going up to the tip. It's a really, really minor detail, and honestly, you can only see it in the sunlight. But I feel like this tiny detail helps make everything look more realistic and defined. Now here is my true egg sin. I used hot glue to adhere all of my petals to my foam base. I usually hate hot glue and avoid it like the plague. I find it really hard to rely on hot glue, but hot glue is really good for like fabric to foam. It tends to soak into the fabric, and the way that it kind of melts to the foam almost permanently bonds the two, and it takes a lot to remove the pieces once they're stuck. For all of the beads on the petals, I actually used some little like gold pearls that I found on Amazon. It was $9 for a pack of 6,000. And some gem tack. This stuff is surprisingly sturdy. I did a petal test where I took a couple of petals and I used gem tack, and then there was another adhesive that I used that was like half the price from Michael's. I literally like smacked these things up against walls and doors and corners. It's tough. It's reliable. I have very little fear about these falling off. For the center black details, I used a mixture of the corsetry satin that I used for Maghda's corset, and then the gold details were done with satin stitching that was done on the same gold taffeta for the bodice and the other pieces, and just carefully cut it out and glued it on top. This is not a true representation of what I did with cutting them out. The ones on the horns are much, much nicer. This was a quick little showy show. But I just glued them right on top. I tried stitching them by hand. It didn't look right, so gluing it was the way to go, and I'm really happy with it. To actually get the horns onto the headdress, I just sewed it by hand. I did some sort of slip stitches. I tried to avoid anything that would leave really large visible stitches, because I don't know, I don't like that. So it took quite a little while, but I put on a good podcast and I just kind of got into the zone, and it was really nice. And once they were sewn on, I could finally do a trial with the actual horns. But something was still missing, the little bug piece at the center. So this little bug piece was sculpted in Blender using, well, their sculpting tools. I started with the most basic sphere form, and I used the different tools available in the free program to help draw everything out, create the dents, pinch everything, crease it, bring it out, create more shapes, whatever I needed. And it turned out really nice. Once I was satisfied with the model that I created, I took it over to my 3D printer, printed it out from resin, and started painting that bad boy. When it comes to painting golds, these are my favorite paints. The brown is my base, the more gold is sort of my basic gold, the lighter gold is my highlight, and then for the ultra fine highlights, I love this Craftsmart gold pen. It is absolutely amazing. Finally, I needed to drill in some little holes for my thing to be sewn on. I applied it with some whip stitches, and then my headdress was complete. I am absolutely 100% in love with this headdress. It turned out so much better than I could have ever anticipated, and it has filled me with so much renewed vigor to finish up this costume and to get to work on all of the other pieces. I've never felt this confident in such a stupid hat. Seriously. Thank you guys so much for joining me on part 1 of my video series of making Maghda. Things are going to come out slowly as I finish up this costume, so stick around and see how everything goes. Follow me on Instagram or Facebook if you want to see more regular progress updates.